So Boker Tov, it's good to have everybody together on this Sunday morning, our concluding program of what has been a really wonderful weekend with our scholar-in-residence, Dr. Michal Raucher. She's led wonderful sessions for us on Friday evening and yesterday after shul, and we're very much looking forward to her session today as well. We are very grateful that we're able to bring Dr. Raucher here as part of our TBS Bioethics Initiative, as well as our Rabbi Lindemann Lifelong Program Fund. Our Bioethics Initiative, of course, started last year, and it's given us an opportunity to bring in some really impressive and cutting-edge speakers and thinkers about bioethics and how they intersect with Judaism and with Torah over the last couple of years. It's a program that we're very proud of here at TBS, and we're very grateful to Audrey and Neil Asbell, to Jeff and Jane Kramer, to the Ravitz Acts of Kindness Fund, and also to Kent and Kent that has enabled us to help bring people in and to think about the programs. And also to Greg Bannett, who's been instrumental in putting those programs together, along with, you can applaud, that's okay, yes. If he's not your father, you can still applaud. And also to Dr. Jeff Kramer, who've been so wonderful in helping us with our bioethics initiative. I also want to welcome in connection to that and announce something very exciting. We have here with us today Dr. Kelly Sorensen of Ursinus College. Dr. Sorensen has been here before for bioethics, and I'm very excited to say that both he and Dr. Raucher have agreed to serve as advisors on for our bioethics initiative committee to help give us insights about topics and help connect us and make suggestions to speakers and leaders in the field. We're very grateful to both of them for being here and also for the generosity of their time in helping out with our bioethics initiative. Also this year, as part of the Rabbi Lindemann Lifelong Learning Center, we've been doing a curriculum from the Jewish Theological Seminary called The Ethical Life, or we've been calling it the Just Life series. We kicked it off with Rabbi Danny Nevins back in the fall, and Rabbi Lindemann and Rabbi Wexler and myself have taught sessions on that. And this morning, Dr. Raucher's topic is the topic that she prepared and put together as part of that curriculum, which of course is on surrogacy, and our topic for today is Whose Womb and Whose Ethics? Surrogacy in Israel and in Jewish Ethics. And Dr. Raucher is a very qualified speaker for this. She's a graduate of the joint program of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and she also has, and I have to say I'm a little embarrassed, this is the one part of her academic bio that I've been forgetting to say all weekend, which is that she has an MA in bioethics from the University of Pennsylvania as well. Woohoo! So tell everyone else who I forgot to mention that too. She did go to Penn also. And a PhD from Northwestern University. She's also a Fulbright Scholar and a JTS Jewish Ethics Fellow as well. She's currently at the University of Cincinnati. This summer, she'll be moving over to Rutgers University, so we're glad she's going to be closer to us and be an assistant professor there in the Judaic Studies department. And we wish her and her husband Yoni much luck in the move this summer, and glad that she's going to be closer. So I'm going to turn everything over to Dr. Raucher. Obviously, if you'd like more to eat, feel free to grab it. We're very happy to have her with us. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Michal Raucher.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Rabbi Peltz, for that wonderful introduction. Can everybody hear me? Wonderful. Okay, thank you to all of the rabbis here, Rabbi Wexler, Rabbi Lindemann, Rabbi Peltz, for sharing this community with me. It's been an honor to be here the whole weekend and to meet so many different segments of this community and see everybody coming together to do some really great learning. I've been studying bioethics for a number of years, and it is always so exciting to share. You know, there's a lot of sort of cutting edge stuff in bioethics, or a lot of cutting edge stuff in science that we're always trying to catch up to. But even if you're not doing the sort of very cutting edge stuff, you know, there's a lot of deep, good ethics stuff to delve into. And I think that's what we're experiencing a lot of this weekend and over the course of your whole bioethics initiative. And I'm also thrilled to be in closer vicinity so that I can be a part of all the other bioethics stuff going on at TBS. It's really, really wonderful. Really, can everybody hear me? I feel like I can't even hear myself. You can hear me in the back? Okay. It's strange that I can't hear myself. Okay. So what I want to start with today is surrogacy seems like one of these really niche reproductive practices. And so we may not all have had even an opportunity to think about what our position is on surrogacy. So I want to present you with three sort of possible trajectories for surrogacy. 3 actions one could take with regards to surrogacy. And I want you to sit with the people at your table, people immediately next to you, and think about, maybe just sit with yourself, right? And think how you feel about these 3 scenarios. Which one seems least ethically problematic? Which one seems totally acceptable? Which one seems beyond the pale of ethical practice? Okay? Just think amongst yourselves about this. And then we'll sort of come together and reflect a little bit. So the first possibility is you need to hire a surrogate, but you have a friend close by who is willing to serve as your surrogate for free. Okay? That's option number 1. You could ask your friend to be your surrogate, in other words, to carry an embryo that you and your spouse have created, either with your own genetic material or with donor genetic material, okay? To carry that embryo to term, and your friend is going to do it free of charge. That's option number 1, okay? Option number 2 is you go through an agency in the US and you end up paying a surrogate to do that same practice, a stranger. You pay this stranger $10,000 to carry the pregnancy to term, okay? That's option number 2. Option number 3 is you go through a service, a company that's run out of India. You don't know much about the company, but you know that it comes recommended, and you've never met the surrogate, and you pay the company about $2,000. $2,000, $10,000 in the second one, $2,000 in this one, to hire this Indian woman to carry to carry the pregnancy for you. Okay? Those are the 3 scenarios. Any questions about those 3 scenarios? Yes? Who's paying for medical care? Great. In the US, in both scenarios, you are. Okay? So the fee is just for, actually in all the scenarios, you're paying for the medical care. Great question. Okay? So the fee is really just her sort of added bonus. Yeah?
$10,000 seems ridiculously cheap. Is that realistic? It seems like it's much more like $50,000 to $100,000, because for someone to go through complications of pregnancy for $10,000 is...
Good. So it's $50,000 to $100,000 when you include all the medical care. But the fee paid for the surrogate. That's why I'm kind of zeroing out. Sometimes. All right. Any other questions before we move on? Before I let you talk?
Do you have control over what they eat or drink in each situation?
I mean, it depends on your relationship with your friend. Some surrogacy contracts in the U.S. will allow for you to have control over that kind of thing. It depends on what state you're in, blah, blah, blah. Let's assume minimal control. Okay? All right. One more question. On Roseanne, it was $50,000. See, if I had known that there was a pop culture reference, I could have we made a joke the other day about pop culture references. I didn't even know that. That's great. Well, okay. All right, go, discuss. Which one seems least problematic and which one seems most problematic? Okay. All right. I think we're a pretty friendly crowd. So I hope we're comfortable. We're going to do a show of hands. Okay? How many people think it is ethically okay to have a woman serve as a friend that you know serve as your surrogate for free? How many people think that is ethically okay? There's a lot of chitter-chatter there. Okay, great. We've got a nice show of hands there. I don't know if the camera saw it. We're being filmed. We're famous. So, okay. I said we're being filmed. There was a nice show of hands. I'm sharing with the camera. Okay. I said, how many people think it's okay for a friend that you know to serve as your surrogate for free? What did I say? Ethical. Oh, yes. What would you prefer? But that's not the same as ethical. Okay, this is... So you're saying you'd prefer to do something that's not ethical? No. Explain to me. Okay, got it. Okay, fine. So I had asked you initially, thank you very much. It's been a long weekend. I had asked you initially, which of the three do you prefer? Okay, fine. So let's do that question. That's a great question too. Which of the three do you prefer? Okay, so how many people prefer that first scenario? How many people think that first scenario is best? When you ask a friend to serve as your surrogate without paying.
But now you said ask. They offer.
It's a different. This is a tough crowd. Wow. I have to tell you, my undergrads don't listen to me so carefully. I think that's the problem. Welcome. This is why I didn't study Talmud, I have to tell you. Okay. Let's rewind the tape. What did I say? Okay, well then let's just kind of blank slate it, okay? You've talked about it a little bit, okay? Even if my question does not reflect what you actually spoke about at your table, let's answer the question. And then we can kind of move on. Okay, so the question is, how many of you think it's ethical to have a friend serve as your surrogate and not pay her? Ethical. Whew. Okay. How many of you think it is ethical to hire an American woman to serve as your surrogate and pay her $10,000? Slightly more people. Okay. More people. Slightly more. A lot of people were fine with the free, though. All right. And how many think it's ethical to hire a woman from India to serve as your surrogate and pay her $10,000 or $2,000? Ethical. This is going to be a great discussion. I know already. Okay. If you had one of those scenarios that you thought was ethical and one that wasn't, can you kind of distinguish for me what made one ethical and one not? What? No.
We're gonna.
We're gonna do a microphone.
We're gonna use a microphone.
We're gonna use a microphone. So raise your hand, and Rabbi Wexler is gonna run around the room. You can call on people.
I'll call on people. All
okay.
right.
And the question is purposely ethical. It's not practical. Okay. Yeah.
I think that hiring the woman in India for the $2,000, you don't know her circumstances. She's not getting the $2,000. Where is she living? What type of protections are made available for her? And because I would be concerned about the circumstances, to me that's slave labor. Whereas you assume the person in the States, she's doing it on her own and not through an agency, and even if she's doing it with an agency, there's a little bit more protection for her.
Okay, great. So we've got concerns for the surrogate in India that raise your kind of ethical hat. Okay, great. Other thoughts about what distinguished one situation from another?
I'm not sure which point of view I'm supposed to be taking here when you say the ethics of it. Are we worried about the possible exploitation of the surrogate?
You could be.
Or are we worrying about the mother, or are we worrying about the fetus? I mean,
Yes, you could be worried, from an ethical standpoint, you could be worried about any one of those things or all of those things.
and,
Absolutely.
And I think, Zelda's point is well taken, that when you talk about using a surrogate in a foreign country, you are already worrying about the possible exploitation of the surrogate, but it brings to mind a whole host of other biases that you may have about using a third world country. So it's a multicolored situation, and I'm not. So because we don't, don't know from whose point of view I'm supposed to be looking at this, and all these my own biases, I don't know where to go.
Great. No, that's fine. That's fine that you don't know where to go. I think that's part of the issue, right? We don't know how to assess this situation. There are so many angles from which to assess this situation. And when you sit with other people at the table, you may realize that one person is concerned about the baby, and one person is concerned about the commissioning couple, and one person is concerned about the surrogacy, and one person may be concerned about the children that exist, who are the surrogates' other children, right? There are any number of things to be concerned about. So I'm not going to answer that question. I'm just going to say, you're right. Other thoughts? Did anybody say surrogacy is not ethical at all? No. All right. Okay.
I have a thought over here.
Good to get a feel for the crowd.
Two other issues that we talked about
Yeah.
is, knowing the surrogate versus not knowing the surrogate, and then paying the surrogate versus not paying. And so that the first scenario is separate on both of those aspects than either of the other two.
Okay, great. So the money issue we're going to get to. Why is knowing the surrogate important versus not knowing the surrogate? Is it better to know the surrogate or not know the surrogate?
I mean, we had some difference of opinions, and I'm not sure there's a right or wrong with that, but, there were some issues that came up, the scenario of this is a friend, you're going out to dinner, and that friend is drinking alcohol, and exposing the child to alcohol, and then so there's tension and issues with that, whereas with someone you don't know, that has
draw
a
up a contract. Okay, great. Okay, one more thought over here, and then we'll move into the meat. Yes?
Thank you. So I agree with all of the thoughts that have been said so far, and what was interesting to me is gutturally, when I thought about the surrogate far away, the thing that came to mind was the ethics of the parent whose child this is to be responsible for that pregnancy. And so the concept of not only paying the person, or if it's someone that offers to do it, it's the management of the care of this child, of this unborn child.
Okay, great, thank you. Great, so as we see, there's a lot to be concerned about. And I start in this way because, as I mentioned, sometimes we don't ever have an opportunity to really even think about the possible, ways in which surrogacy can come about, right? And I think it's good to start off a session on ethics to just take our temperature, to say sort of, where are we starting? What are the issues that are relevant to us, right? What are the things that we're concerned about? So that when we delve into the texts, right, and we delve into what you're going to see is sort of how surrogacy works in Israel, you'll have a frame of reference for thinking, okay, this is where I started. These were the questions that I had. These are the things that are happening either in the Jewish texts or in the current situation in Israel. And it gives you sort of a starting point, right? We compare a lot, right? So it's good to take stock and see, this is where I start, and maybe I end up somewhere different. Maybe I see that I've got concerns that aren't raised anywhere, and what do I do with those concerns? So that's why we started like that. Now what we're going to do today is compare two bodies of data. The first is some Jewish ethical arguments about surrogacy. Okay? Jewish ethical arguments about surrogacy are by and large halachic arguments about surrogacy. The language of Jewish ethics is significantly, although not solely, made up of halakha, of Jewish law, right? So you're going to see some halachic arguments about surrogacy that raise a couple of ethical questions. And those two ethical questions are we comfortable with paying for surrogacy? What I call the money question, right? Should we be paying for surrogacy? Or is this a service that should be offered up for free? Okay, that's question number one for the Jewish ethicists. And question number two that the Jewish ethicists ask is, who's the mom? Is the mother the surrogate, the woman who births the child? Or is the mom the woman who is intended to be the mother at the end of the process, right? Or, as I sort of alluded to at the beginning, you could be using donor eggs, right? So is the mom the genetic mother, right? Okay, you could have 3 possible mothers there, right? So the Jewish ethicists are asking, what is it that makes a mother? Okay? What is it that makes a mother? So we've got the money question and the mother question. I just realized those are 2 M's, and my name's Michal. I should call this like the 3M session or something. Okay, so we've got the mother question and the money question. So we're going to look at those from the context of Jewish ethics. We're going to look at Jewish ethical sources. And you have them in front of you. We'll do some nice Chevruta study. We'll come back together. We'll discuss. It'll be a lot of fun. We're also going to look at the way surrogacy works on the ground in Israel. Now, surrogacy has been legal in Israel for over 10 years. Okay? There is a big legal infrastructure for surrogacy. It is managed by government committees. It's one of the most sophisticated systems for the legalization of surrogacy that we have in the Western world, actually. America is a big mess. It's different from state to state. So we're going to look at sort of how it works in Israel based on some anthropological research, interviews, observations, reading chat group conversations, sitting on the approving committee. We're going to read some of that data from an ethnography by a scholar named Eli Timan, who did interviews with both surrogates and the intended couples and talked about the experience throughout. And you'll get some of the quotes from that book, too. Some of the sort of direct line to people who have been surrogates and people who have hired surrogates. And we're going to compare those 2 bodies of data. In order to ask the question, are they both thinking about the same ethical issues when they're engaged with this question, right? So just like at your table, you had some that were concerned about the baby, and some that were concerned about the mother, and some that were the surrogate, and some that were concerned about the mother, right? The intended mother. You'll see a range of ethical issues that show up, right? And a vast difference between what the Jewish ethicists are concerned about and what the people who are engaged with surrogacy are concerned about, right? There are 2 sets of ethical issues there and ways in which they resolve those issues. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, okay? Everybody with me? Nod if you're with me. I like a good nod. Okay, great. Okay, so first, a few definitions. The first is, I've been talking for like 15 minutes. First, we talk about surrogacy in 2 different ways. We talk about traditional surrogacy, which is what we find in the Bible. You see your source number 1 here from Breshit, from the book of Breshit. Traditional surrogacy versus gestational surrogacy. So gestational surrogacy is what I've mentioned. It's when you take the egg and the sperm from either donors or from the intended couple, right? And you perform in vitro fertilization, basically, right? You fertilize the egg in a petri dish, right? And then you implant the embryo into the surrogate. Okay, that's gestational surrogacy, and that's what we practice today. Traditional surrogacy is what's crudely called, I'm sorry about my throat, that's gross, the good old-fashioned way. So the surrogate is impregnated directly from the intended husband, right? And we see this is what we see in the Bible, right? So let's look at source number 1, okay? I want to look at it together. Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, right? We know Sarah was struggled to get pregnant for many, many years. She had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Look, the Lord has kept me from bearing. Consort with my maid. Perhaps I shall have a son through her." Literally, be built up through her. And I want to direct you to that Hebrew. Ulai ibaneh mimena. Ulai ibaneh mimena. And you'll see it's bolded over there. And Abram heeded Sarai's request. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took her maid, Hagar the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt in the land of Canaan for 10 years, and gave her to her husband, Abram, as a concubine. He cohabited with Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was lowered in her esteem. let's look closely at that Hebrew that I pointed you to. Okay, ulai ibaneh mimena. I will have a son or be built up through her. Literally, I will be built up through her. But how does it become ibaneh? What do you hear in baneh? Ibaneh? Ben, right? I will have a son, an ibaneh, ben, ibaneh, the same word, right? I will be built up and I will have a son through her. What's the connection she's establishing between having a child and being raised? Self-worth. Great. Self-worth. Okay, I'm going to try to repeat answers for the sake of the camera. She's going to increase in self-worth after she has a child, right? That's how she's going to be built up, right? Okay. And yet, what happens to Sarai's value when Hagar becomes pregnant? It dips, right? It goes down. It's lowered. She is lowered, right, when compared to Hagar. Yes, question.
I don't understand that last page. In whose eyes was her worth lowered?
Great. It is a little confusing, right? We've got a few too many she pronouns. Good. It is a little confusing. The vast majority of rabbinic scholars read this as Sarai is lowered. A couple do try to sort of twist it around and say Hagar is lowered. But, okay, when we get to the very end, you'll see that it does mean Sarai is lowered. Okay?
But in Hagar's eyes, Sarai is lowered.
How
What I'm confused is Sarai lowered in her own eyes or only in Hagar's eyes? That's where I'm confused.
Great. Okay, so the question was, is Sarai lowered in Hagar's eyes or in her own eyes, right? In her own conception of herself. Great question. And I'm going to ask you to hold it until the very end. Can you remember it until the very end? Great. Okay. Another thought.
I don't think I've ever read it.
Oh, sorry. Wait for the microphone.
I don't know if I've ever read it this way, but it says Abraham dwelt in the land of Canaan for 10 years. Could this have been also an act of desperation? I think I might have read it in a novel as opposed to biblical study. Mm-hmm. But if, after 10 years, if you can't conceive a child, the marriage can be dissolved?
Right. So there is a sort of Jewish legal stipulation that would allow for that to happen. There is. But we're sort of conflating time periods. But I could see how a rabbinic author would want to read that back into it. Yeah.
2 points.
Yes.
One, I'm a little concerned about even describing this as surrogacy.
Why?
Because, one thing, Hagar is not a surrogate. She is the genetic mother of Ishmael.
Okay.
All right. The other thing is, I find it hard to believe that Hagar would not be raised in everybody's eyes because she has produced Abraham's sole heir at this point. So she clearly has much greater status than she had before.
Great. Was this child supposed to be Hagar's, though? Was the child supposed to be Hagar's, though?
Was he supposed to be? The answer is no. The
No.
question is, was he?
So, right, okay. So, but in that way, right, Hagar was supposed to be a surrogate for Sarai. You're right, that in terms of the genetic material, listen, in the Bible, they didn't have IVF, they didn't have in vitro fertilization, right? They couldn't get Sarai's genetic material into Hagar, right? That's why I say there's a difference between traditional surrogacy as the way we practice it in the Bible and contemporary surrogacy, which is gestational surrogacy, right? So the surrogate is just the gestator, but has no genetic connection to the resulting child, okay? But the point is that this child, right now we know that Ishmael is Hagar's, and we claim no connection, well, very little connection to Ishmael, right? But initially, this child was supposed to be Sarai. Sarai was supposed to be built up through this child, right? Okay. Let's continue. Gestational surrogacy, I've got a couple of examples, a couple of quotes about gestational surrogacy. And these quotes come from, does anybody remember this New York Times Magazine cover? Yeah, it's from about 10 years ago. I remember it because I'm obsessed with this stuff. We still have it. And I've kept it. Does somebody else, you still have it? No. Oh. I'm not alone. Okay. So the article was written by Alex Kuzinski, who's here in the slim black dress. Okay, she's a writer for the New York Times. And she hired a surrogate after many failed IVF attempts. And her surrogate is Kathy, the pregnant woman on the cover with her. Okay? And Alex charts her sort of the evolution of the surrogacy process, her feelings about hiring Kathy, her reflections on it. And I just want to point you to a couple of quotes. There's so many wonderful quotes in here. But here, these are sources number 2 and 3. Strictly speaking, she was a vessel, the carrier, the biological babysitter for my baby. Or as she put it in her essay, she had to apply to become a surrogate, I will serve as the foster mother to the baby until it's born. But it was easy to think of her as carrying my baby. She wasn't desperate for the money, so our relationship wouldn't have to feel like a purely commercial enterprise or a charitable one. The only major factors separating us were the fact that Kathy could have a baby and I could not, and we had $25,000 at hand. That's source number 1. Source number 2. This 3. Later in the fall, Kathy went to Las Vegas with her husband, who was attending a conference. I took the news badly. My tiny child, now that there was a sex and identity, I could think of him as a child, was out there in Vegas at a craps table. I worried about the flight and whether the pressure would harm him. The thought crossed my mind to ask Kathy if it was really necessary to go, but I knew I couldn't. I had given her my baby, and I would have to give her my trust as well. What are the broader issues that Alex is struggling with? What are the ethical issues for her? How is she struggling with this reality?
I think something for me that's really striking me with all these examples is the issue of bodily autonomy. Mm-hmm. And I remember even when I was pregnant, feeling as though society viewed me now as the vessel, and that I suddenly had given up my right to make certain decisions about my own body and what I did to it because there were babies inside it. And how much more so is that the case if you are, contractually carrying that baby for someone else, and sort of, are you then being paid to actually give up your autonomy? But, there are examples like, okay, drinking when you have the baby that are maybe more black and white, although they're actually not. But then, something like people say don't eat deli meat, or don't, so there are things that are so much more kind of gray areas. And at what point does it become that for 9 months someone else gets to dictate, how much you sleep, how much you exercise, what you eat, when you eat, all those things. And, even more so going back to, let's say, the story of Hagar, I'm guessing, first of all, that based on the power play of her being Sarai's servant, that she didn't actually have the ability to consent or not. And then once it happened, she probably didn't have any autonomy over those decisions. And how do you wrestle with that?
Great, absolutely. Absolutely. So you actually answered more from the perspective of the surrogate, right? The sort of struggle of bodily autonomy, and it's not just then, right, her own choices that she's making, but she's contracted with another person making those choices. And I think that's one side of it. And the other side is what Alex is struggling with is the reality is she knows that that's the case, right? That society is already putting pressure on women to behave in certain ways when they're pregnant, right? And here she is, she wants to be another person who puts pressure on her surrogate, right? But she's struggling with that, right? And she knows Kathy should have bodily autonomy, right? But she feels some responsibility for those babies, or the baby, yeah.
That's where I think the money issue comes into play, because if you're paying $25,000 or $50,000 or whatever, maybe then you should have some autonomy about how the person it's, when you hire
control,
someone,
rather.
When you hire somebody to, renovate your kitchen, you have control over it because you're paying them. So maybe if you're paying that kind of money, you should have some control over how they care for themselves during that time.
Great. That's absolutely something, right? She's struggling with that, right? Do I get to, because I'm paying her for a service, right, dictate what she's eating and where she's going and all of these things, right? Great question.
Just
Great
a quick comment on what Becca said,
Yeah.
which is Now you know what it's like to be the father, right? If you don't have control over you're the parent, it's your stuff that made the baby, and yet somebody else is making the decisions. Hopefully you're working together in a nice way, and it's all good, but you don't have control.
Right. You don't have control. Okay. Okay. Yeah, one last comment on this. Run, run, run.
Well, it would seem that having a contract would give you control, but what if the surrogate mother doesn't adhere to the contract? Then what? What are your options? You won't take the baby. I mean, what do you do?
Or even more, right? What if the baby doesn't come out the way you thought it was going to come out?
That's another issue altogether.
Is that a voided contract? And what are the legal ramifications? And these are both legal questions and large ethical questions. What's the relationship between these two people, right? What rights does one person have, right? What is the correct way we are supposed to engage in a relationship? So from there, I want to go directly to this money question. And here I'm going to have you discuss in Chevruta the next few sources, okay? Discuss in pairs or in, groups of 3, the next few sources. And let me just introduce you to the next few sources. So Rabbi Emanuel Jacobovitz, this is source number 4, is considered one of the, fathers of Jewish bioethics, okay? He's writing in the 1970s about the ethics of surrogacy, and you'll see he has this was before gestational surrogacy was really practiced, and he's got a pretty warped view of how surrogacy actually happens, okay? Kind of ignore his medical confusion for the sake of the sort of ethical issue that he's raising. Okay, that's source number 4. Source number 5 is Rabbi Aaron Mackler, who is a conservative rabbi and a Jewish ethicist and a professor at Duquesne, who writes for the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, the conservative movement's halachic body of authority. That didn't come out right. Yeah, okay. And he's writing also about the ethics of surrogacy and what his concerns are. And then sources 6 and 7 go together. So 6 is a source from the book of Vayikra, right? You shall not oppress your neighbor, lo ta'ashik, okay? Ta'ashok, lo ta'ashok your neighbor. And this idea of exploitation and oppression go together for Rabbi Mark Gelman. That's the 7th source, who's also concerned about exploitation. So those are the 4 sources that I'd like you to read together. You have questions right at the bottom. What are the problems with paying a surrogate, according to these Jewish ethicists? According to Jacobovitz, how does surrogacy countermand kvod habriot, or human dignity? And why is surrogacy considered exploitation? Okay, those are the questions I want you to think about as you're reading those sources. Okay? I'll give you a few minutes. Go ahead. Okay, let's come together. I want to start discussing. According to these Jewish ethicists, question number 1, what are the problems with paying a surrogate? Why is paying a surrogate wrong according to these thinkers? Why is paying a surrogate wrong according to these thinkers? Okay, it makes the child a commodity, okay, to be bought and sold. Why else? Who's enslaved?
Person who is robbed of their agency through the coercion that the money entails.
Oh, sorry. Great. Okay, so it's slavery because there is a person deprived of their agency who is getting the payment, meaning the surrogate. Okay, so the surrogate is considered like a slave, and that's the problem with the money, right? Once you're paying somebody, they are kind of bound to you in a way that they may not be bound otherwise. What else? Sorry?
Also questioning the motivation behind it. Certainly in the first example, where it is a naturally fertilized egg that is then transplanted probably for perhaps purely the convenience or the ego or the figure or whatever of the natural mother.
Yeah, Jacobowitz is pretty nasty, and so I feel it's appropriate to be nasty about him too. First, let it be known. So first of all, as I mentioned, his science is off, right? We're not talking about eggs that are fertilized within a woman's body, and then some woman says, I don't really feel like getting pregnant, and they suck the embryo out and put it in somebody else. Jacobowitz, and I said, to be fair, in the 1970s, they weren't practicing gestational surrogacy. So he didn't know really how this could happen. But he does use this language of convenience, right? That there's some imaginary woman who just doesn't feel like getting pregnant, and therefore she's hiring a surrogate. And we know that actually that's not the case in 99% of these surrogacy arrangements. These are couples who could not get pregnant, women who cannot carry a pregnancy to term. It's not a convenience issue. But he definitely has that judgment about women who cannot get pregnant, right? Or he thinks they won't get pregnant. And so for him, it is something that you're basically buying and selling. You're buying and selling people as a convenience to you. What else? Did you actually read the sources? This table was chit-chatting. I said I wouldn't call on them.
2 questions.
Yes.
Number 1, does God make junk?
Does God make junk?
Does God make junk?
You answer the question. I think you have an answer in mind.
Well, the second question is, does God give men free will?
Okay. And your answers are? These are
I don't
beyond
think-
my pay grade.
I don't think God makes junk. And what I've always heard is that God gives men free will. And that's why there's evil in the world, because it exists, but we have to live with it. It's the human condition.
Relate us back to surrogacy. Bring us back to the topic.
Well, whatever happens as a result of surrogacy, God made it, and we have free will.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Some of these scholars think surrogacy is considered exploitation. Why is it exploitation? Who is being exploited? What makes it exploitation? The surrogate is being exploited.
Potentially the surrogates being exploited depending on the arrangement. If they have to take an economic arrangement because of abject poverty, for example, and they take that on not wanting to really do it, then that's exploitation. If they also have a secondary motivation or a primary motivation of helping a couple, then that's not necessarily exploitation. That's not exploitation at all, but they could still be paid for it.
Okay. So they say if you're only doing it for the money, then you're being exploited, right? If you're only doing it for the money, and you have to because you need the money, right? Then it's an exploitative relationship. Great. Other thoughts about these sources? Something else that struck you about these sources?
It could be that the mother is being exploited depending on her inability to have a child, and the surrogate can hold that over her head and so that the mother can be exploited.
The mother, okay, so it's similar to our sort of Sarai and Hagar kind of thing. Okay, so you're thinking, right, for that mother, okay? Aaron Mackler actually also introduces other characters into this. Who is Aaron Mackler concerned about? The children. Which children? The children that result from the surrogacy, right? That they might feel like commodities. We talked about this. Aaron Mackler is also concerned about the surrogate's other children, right? That the surrogate's other children might see their mother having, being pregnant, giving birth, and then giving the child away, and they might say, what's going to happen to me, right? So Aaron Mackler, in sort of expressing this concern about the commodification of children, right, is concerned of the effects this would have on a far-reaching family. Good, far-reaching. Okay. So how does Israel deal with the surrogacy, with the money problem? Here's a bit on the history of surrogacy in Israel. I mentioned that the Israeli Knesset legalized surrogacy in 1996. It was one of the only countries to do so at the time. Now, the minister of health, Ephraim Sneh, consulted with 2 chief rabbis of Israel for their guidance. The rabbis were mostly concerned with the possibility of a surrogate arrangement yielding what Jewish law would consider a mamzer, or a child born of a forbidden relationship. So the Minister of Health added provisions into the draft of the law that would alleviate these religious concerns. So here are the provisions. Only single or divorced women can serve as surrogates. In other words, so she's not a married woman. The religion of the surrogate has to be the same as the commissioning couple. Okay? So Jewish surrogates serve for Jewish couples, Christian surrogates serve for Christian couples, et cetera, et cetera. Egg donation is permitted, but not sperm donation. The surrogate cannot be related to the commissioning couple, and all births are recorded in the National Registry, meaning you can't have sort of under-the-table surrogacy. Now, in general, the rabbinic establishment supported surrogacy under the broad commandment of pru urvu. As you might know, Israel supports a broad range of reproductive technologies. And the Minister of Health, Ephraim Sneh, incorporated these religious concerns into the law, and then he received the support of the religious parties. So it enabled the legislation to go through without a hitch. In addition to the request from the religious leaders, the law also stipulates that all surrogacy arrangements have to be approved and overseen by an approving committee that's made up of 7 members. 3 physicians, a clinical psychologist, a social worker, a law, and a clergy person, depending on the religion of the couple and the surrogate. All parties in the arrangement have to be Israeli citizens, and the surrogate mother should have children of her own. Following the birth, the social worker is actually considered the legal guardian of the baby until the commissioning couple completes the adoption request. So the baby does not go directly from surrogate to the commissioning couple. The approving committee supervises all the expenses of surrogacy and can recommend monthly payments to the surrogate mother. The national health care in Israel pays for all the fertility treatments and all the surrogate's medical care, but the couple still pays about $25,000 to the surrogate. And those could be made over monthly payments or sometimes a lump sum at the end. Okay? So that's the background that we're dealing with. Now, Israel could have recommended, like these Jewish ethicists do, that the payment makes things problematic, right? The payment makes this considered exploitation. They didn't want to consider surrogacy, though, an altruistic act that should be done without any payment, because they thought altruism wouldn't be enough of a justification for this kind of work. And the legislators agreed that offering a payment for surrogacy would help to actually distance the surrogate from the commissioning couple, to make this more of a professional relationship. Economic need is a motivating factor for many of the surrogates. About half of them come from the Israeli lower to middle class, and they did need the $25,000. But the payments, the law suggests, are helpful in actually preventing the exploitation of the surrogates. Also, even though, in other words, this is actually a really great example. The image we have of surrogacy in America is of a very wealthy couple hiring somebody who's not very wealthy, right? It's what Mark Gellman refers to as class exploitation, right? That's not the case in Israel. Most of the commissioning couples and the surrogates were in the same economic class. It was very difficult for the commissioning couple to actually make those payments of $25,000. Now, the question of whether Israeli surrogates are actually exploited can be answered by considering whether the surrogates maintain some bodily autonomy. We heard that phrase going on, right? Whether they have some choices over the decisions they make during pregnancy. On the one hand, surrogacy is treated as an extension of fertility treatments for the intended mother. So whenever they go to the doctor, there's one medical file for the 2 women. And it's under the name of the intended mother, not on the surrogate's name. Additionally, the intended mother and the surrogate share one doctor. And now it could lead to conflicts of interest if the surrogate's health is in danger as a result of the pregnancy, right? Who is the doctor responsible to, right? That's a valid question. Now, each contract is a little bit different between the surrogate and the couples. But we have found that there are cases where intended parents regulated or wanted to regulate what kind of food they ate, the surrogates ate, what kind of behaviors they participated in, whether they had relations with partners, even if they weren't married, whether they had relations with partners during the pregnancy, whether they observed certain religious observations during the pregnancy, right? Whether they only ate kosher food, whether they observed Shabbat. These could be written into the contract. Now, a surrogate at any point in the development of this contract can walk away and say, I don't want to, I'm not going to eat kosher food. Not going to happen, right? And they'll find another surrogate. The surrogates apply independently to the approving committee to become surrogates. They go through a rigorous, I think it's almost a 2-year approval process, okay? And the intended parents apply independently. And then the approving committee supervises the creation of the contract, okay? Now, what we found actually, right, even though we know there can be any number of stipulations put on the surrogates express a great deal of bodily autonomy during the pregnancy. And that's where I want to point you to this source number 8, where they map their bodies. The surrogates don't see themselves as vulnerable parties in this relationship. You can see what they've done is sort of taken, this is an image that one of the surrogates spoken to sort of dictated about how different parts of herself can be disaggregated for the sake of the pregnancy to maintain a certain amount of distance. They disaggregate their bodies to maintain distinctions between themselves, the fetus, the mother, her own family, and in so doing, she can separate the couple's control over her womb from the couple's control over her own self, her identity, and the rest of her body. For instance, women see themselves as babysitters or vessels. In Hebrew, a surrogate is referred to as a pundakait, an innkeeper, right? She doesn't see herself as a mother. She's more like a babysitter. The womb, therefore, is just holding the genetic material for someone else. It's temporary, and it doesn't invade any other parts of her identity. Surrogates don't diminish or erase their role in the process, but rather understand themselves to be heroes, actually, mythic heroines in a tale of self-invention and rebirth. You probably know Israel has a very pronatalist vibe to it, right? Israel wants Jewish women to reproduce. And surrogates are sort of superhero women, right? They reproduce not just for their own families, but they do a kind of national service. They talk about their surrogacy role within the same parallel as their national army service, right? Just as I served the army, I'm also serving other Israeli couples and having babies for them. They consider themselves model female citizens because they can do for other women what other women can't do themselves. Okay, so they reimagine this relationship. Now, so instead of the inherent exploitation that we saw in the Jewish sources, right, the Jewish sources imagine that this is an exploitative relationship, bad, bad, bad. Instead, what we see is a paradox where the surrogate sees herself with such importance, while the state, her economic need, and the commissioning couple will try to rein that in and limit some of the actions that she takes. But the surrogate's self-valoration can be seen within the national discourse, right? And when it's done in that way, we understand that she's not being apologetic, she's not being naive, she's following regular cultural practice wherein women who can have babies are held in a higher esteem than women who can't within Israel. The surrogates may be less financially secure than the commissioning couples, but the couple's inability to reproduce sets them apart. They become vulnerable in their relationship because they can't reproduce and the surrogate can. So the point I want to make is that, the Jewish ethical sources are considering one aspect of this question about money, right? But when we see it as it actually plays out on the ground, all these other contextual factors become really relevant in asking who's exploited, who's vulnerable, and what role the money plays in that relationship. Thoughts, questions before we move on?
if someone breaks the contract. Like you said, they could write into it, if they want the surrogate to keep kosher, for example. What happens if that doesn't come through? Do they not get the money? Does the couple then not get the baby? How does that work?
So it goes back to the approving committee. Great question. It goes back to the approving committee, and the approving committee has to try to mediate a sort of relationship, a sort of outcome that everybody's going to be happy with. Okay? Abortion is a possible outcome. But moreover, there's probably a revision of the contract and a sort of slap on the wrist for a surrogate. And the surrogate may then, if she wants to be a surrogate again, may not be approved by the approving committee to be a surrogate again because she's not a good rule follower, or maybe set up with a couple that doesn't have such expectations of her behavior. Great question. Other questions?
This is more of a comment. The figure in paragraph 8 is a complete fiction.
What do you mean it's a fiction?
It couldn't be more artificial. The surrogate is not just a vessel. All of the tissues that surround and nourish the fetus are products of the surrogate. The placenta is not an absolute wall and barrier between fetus and surrogate. Cells are exchanged, fluids are exchanged. They're one unit, and this is a complete fiction that you can separate them.
It's a fiction for you. But the point is that a surrogate, right, the surrogates are drawing this map. So why are the surrogates creating such a strong wall between themselves, the rest of their identity, right, and the job that they're doing in their uterus? Maybe because they have to give up a child. So you're imagining, right, otherwise they might feel too emotionally connected to the child.
They're physically connected.
Because they're physically connected, they might be emotionally connected.
Absolutely.
Okay. Anybody else think, comments, yes.
How are the papers drawn after the baby comes? It means, is there a record of the surrogated mother as being a mother or part of that process, or the birth certificate is solely on the name of the couple who hired her?
The latter. The birth certificate is solely with the couple who hired her.
And there is no record at all about the surrogated mother?
Nope. In the mother's medical files, there's a history of her hiring a surrogate, but the child immediately belongs to the social worker. The surrogate is never listed as a parent of this child.
So if the child, the child finds out later that the child is a production of a surrogated mother and wants to look for that person, do they have a way to find it?
They do, because all the records are kept by the approving committee, right? And the records are intentionally kept, right? Remember, the initial concern is that there might be a mamzer that results not just from that relationship, but from a future one, right? So you wouldn't want that baby to want to marry the surrogate's other children.
Yes.
Right? Okay.
And the mother, it means the one that carried, the surrogated mother, can never claim any ownership or family relation to the child?
Usually they don't, because the intended parents want to maintain that difference, right? Did I hear a why not? Why not? Why couldn't the surrogate's other child marry that baby that results from the surrogate? Good question. Anybody have a guess? It's a mamzer issue, right? It's some of the confusion over whether the surrogate is really a mother, right? So we can make and we're going to get there in a second. We can make a lot of legal distinctions between whether the mother is the gestational mother, right? Is the mother somebody who gives birth, or is the mother somebody who has the genetic material, right? But there's still a lot of messiness there, right? There's still a lot of, well, maybe somebody might consider the surrogate the mother, and therefore her children are siblings with the baby that she carried.
But genetically,
Genetically, they're not. Okay, let's link into the next material. Okay, let's jump into the next material. Okay, so the next question is maternal identity. This is the second major set of issues that Jewish ethicists have considered. And again, there are it's really a niche halachic question of who the mother is, right? It's a question of Jewish law, but there is a larger philosophical issue that relates to kinship, right? How do we establish maternal identity, right? How do we establish parental identity? What does that mean? So please, we're going to jump back into these sources. And I'm going to ask you again to read them with your table and then discuss the questions, okay? The first source is from the Shulchan Aruch, the legal code from the 16th century. And this source informs the Jewish ethicists that follow. So the source is, if a non-Jewish woman converts when she is pregnant, her child does not require immersion, right? So that's the source that's going to inform the next one. Okay, the next one is Aaron Mackler again. And the third is Ellie Spitz, who has actually a very different perspective from Aaron Mackler. So please, read 9, 10, and 11, and then you've got questions on the next page. Okay, let's come back together. How do these writers think parental identity should be determined? How do these writers think parental identity should be determined? What makes a mother, according to Aaron Mackler? What makes a mother, according to Ellie Spitz? They disagree, right? Aaron Mackler says what matters? The gestation, right? The gestation matters. The experience of pregnancy matters, Aaron Mackler says, right? Anybody read that differently? I'm not getting a lot of nods. Differently? Yes? No. Yes. No. Okay, we're going. Okay, Aaron Mackler says the experience of pregnancy is what makes you a mother. Therefore, in the relationship between a surrogate and intended mother, who is the mother? The surrogate. The surrogate. That's what Aaron Mackler wants to say, right? And he's reading that based on the Shulchan Aruch source, right? That if you're pregnant and you convert to Judaism, that baby is automatically Jewish because you're Jewish, okay? In other words, the religious identity of the pregnant woman matters for the religious identity of the child. Therefore, that the gestational mother has gestated this pregnancy makes her connected to that child as a parent. Okay? That's the connection that Aaron Mackler wants to draw. But Ellie Spitz says something else. Ellie Spitz says something else matters in establishing that relationship between parents and children. What matters for Ellie Spitz?
Provided the genetic material.
Good, so it's people who provided genetic material, but it's less about that genetic connection for Ellie Spitz and more about what? Initiating it, good, initiating the pregnancy. The people who are planning on being the parents, right? The people who have looked forward to this, who have worked very, very hard to establish, right, an embryo, to invest in a surrogate, to make plans for having a baby. Those are emotional, important pieces in establishing a kinship relationship to that resulting child. That's what Ellie Spitz says, right? So you've got kind of two sides of the coin, right? One, and the Jewish sources sort of all the way down the line toe this really carefully. And they each are holding different perspectives, right? One is going to say that the genetic material or the intended parents matters. Those who were planning on becoming parents are the ones who are considered the parents. And the other half of the rabbinic authorities say, no, it's the gestation, right? The one who is carrying the pregnancy is considered the mother of the child. And we can't get away from that. Whether we like it or not, we can't get away from it, okay? Those are kind of two sides of that debate. And they're, right, we know that Jewish law has a lot of disagreements, right, that are never fully resolved, right? We're all familiar with this, the machloket, okay? This is one of those disagreements, right, where it's not resolved. We're left wondering, well, who is the mother, right? This seems like such a critical question, right? Okay, questions, thoughts, before we move on to the Israeli scene? Yeah.
Two thoughts. As it relates to this, I think the biblical source, as it relates to this, I think the biblical sources, frankly, are unimportant, because in those cases, the surrogate was the genetic mother. So that, that changes that.
Right.
The other thing, as it relates to, which is the mother, you have a similar situation with adoptions.
Absolutely.
Who is the mother?
Absolutely.
Is it the one who carried it, or is it the one who's raised it? And at what point does it become a difference? Is it after 3 months? Is it after 30 years?
Right.
So, as I was saying here, as science resolves a problem,
right,
it creates 4 more.
Right. Okay, and I will add to that. As Jewish law, or as law, may solve one problem, there are many more that remain, right? So the Israeli law solves this one problem of what's the religion of this baby, right, by saying that the surrogate and the commissioning couple have to be of the same religion, right? That way, nobody needs to be converted. There doesn't need to be a question of whether this person can get married to the blah, 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 right? We know that there is one religion involved here, so Israeli law solves this one problem, right? But there's still this very delicate negotiation between the surrogates and the intended parents, the intended mothers in particular, of clearly demarcating between the surrogate and the mother, right? The one who just carries the pregnancy and the one who becomes a mother for eternity. And that's the next set of sources that I want to turn you to. These are quotes from the ethnography, okay? So Ellie T. Mann says that several of the intended mothers, right, so the women who were not pregnant, told me of the dreams that they had during the later months of their surrogate's pregnancy. They were unable to recall the exact content of the dreams, but remembered, upon awakening, that they had experienced a dream related to pregnancy, to babies, or to themselves being pregnant. Rona, an intended mother, for instance, told me in the 7th month of her surrogate's pregnancy, I feel like my mind is preparing me for motherhood. I have these dreams all the time where I'm pregnant, right? These are pregnancy dreams, right? The intended mothers talk about having pregnancy dreams, right? Dreams of being pregnant, of this resulting child. The intended mothers talked about having pregnancy cravings, even though they weren't pregnant, right? They expressed those cravings. The intended mothers walk around with the ultrasound images of those babies, right? And the surrogates love the ultrasounds. The surrogates love the ultrasounds because that way they can distance themselves, right? Sometimes there's criticism about the ultrasound, there's no imager, it's just the baby, right? But the surrogates can therefore say, good, let's go get an ultrasound, and then you take the baby home, right? Because the intended mother is then taking that image home, and she can hold it, and she can hold that baby, that fetus, right, and show it off to friends, right? So the intended mothers use the ultrasounds as a way of connecting to that baby, and the surrogates use the ultrasound as a way of distancing themselves from the baby, right? So there's sort of that exchange there. There's more. Edith, a surrogate, says, I made sure that she becomes attached because my role is to create the attachment between them. It actually strengthened me and my detachment from the child. Beyond merely facilitating a connection and allaying fears, Edith sees her role as making a mother, helping her intended mother move into her new identity, right? So they, in this relationship that they have with each other, establish, right, that The surrogate, as the surrogate distances herself, the intended mother can get closer, right, and become a mother. The surrogate talks less about making a baby and more about making a mother, right? She doesn't see herself as a mother at all. Now an intended mother is speaking. This is source number 14. I felt that she, who is carrying my child, she is the closest thing to me, as if we were two halves of a belly that unifies us. Now, if they're the closest thing to one another, right, they talk about being interchangeable, right? So it doesn't matter that the intended mother was never pregnant, right? She's got a surrogate who's half of her, who was pregnant with her child, right? See how they kind of negotiate that relationship? They create that relationship? Thoughts, questions?
I think it's interesting that...
Wait. What do you think is interesting?
These all address the mother and the connection with her and the baby.
Yeah.
What about the father to take over?
Great question. What about the father? If you're a man in the room and you feel left out, you are. You are. They sort of operate, so, there's been some research on the fathers also, and to a great extent they do feel left out. Because in these arrangements, right, the surrogate and the intended mother end up being a sort of couple there, right? They're the couple that goes to the ultrasound together, and the father does feel a little left out. I have no better answer for you. It's a great question. I'll work on it. Other thoughts, comments? Yes.
Was there ever a situation where the surrogate didn't feel like this or felt differently? I mean, these are all four.
Was there ever a situation when the surrogate didn't feel like this, right? Felt actually really negative about this relationship? Great. So the surprising thing is, during the pregnancies, no, they feel great about it, right? So the research is showing that this actually is pretty representative, right, of how surrogates feel. The difference is after the birth. After the birth, they feel differently. But why? They're not sad about the baby leaving. They're not sad about losing this child. They never established a connection to the child. But they established a connection to the intended mother. Okay? And after the pregnancy, the intended mother doesn't want anything to do with her, right? Because then she would have to continually be reminded of the fact that she didn't carry this pregnancy, right? So one surrogate talks about the fact that at the bris, afterwards, she was going to invite her surrogate to come to the bris. And her mother, so the grandmother of this baby, said, "Why would you do that? You're just going to confuse everybody over whose child this is," right? And so they sort of have this very firm break with the intended mothers, and that's what the surrogates talk about when they talk about being hurt and sad. Absolutely, it's a great question. Yeah, last question over here, and then we'll wrap up.
This business of working to make a mother is such a noble sentiment. Do you see any connection between this sentiment, this idea, and the extension of the doula notion? The idea that a doula is someone who joins with a woman to create another mother, a new mother in the world.
Oh, thanks. My battery's running low. Just with the microphone. I could go on for hours. Do I see any connection with the doula who's also sort of shepherding a mother into the world? Yeah, I think there is. I think there is. I think, though, what I'll add also is that the surrogate in Israel, because remember I mentioned it's sort of, she thinks of herself as a heroine, right? And if you look at this very last image that I include here, right? It's a great cartoon, but so she imagines herself as a hero who can bring babies into the world, right? Within the discourse of Israeli pronatalism. And it's really important, and it's very nice. It's also, though, kind of a necessary way of her distancing herself from that actual baby. Because in Israel, right, the other part of that narrative is, what kind of a woman would give up a baby? Right? That's not me speaking, that's the discourse, right, within Israel. What kind of a woman would be pregnant and then give up a baby? And so in order for her to understand this relationship that she's establishing, she has to understand herself as making a mother and not making a baby, right? She's creating motherhood. She's not creating a baby.
Excuse me. Is the surrogate allowed to be the egg donor?
No. Thank you for that one-word answer. No, a surrogate is not allowed to be the egg donor. That would make everything very complicated. Absolutely not. Okay, I want to just go back very, 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 very quickly to Breshit, to the next few verses, just to wrap us up, to return us to where we were and go back. Now follow those first verses in the beginning. Sarai says to Avram, the wrong done me is your fault. I myself put my maid in your bosom, and now that she sees that she is pregnant, I am lowered in her esteem. Getting back to the question from the beginning. The Lord decide between you and me, and then we all know what happens. Avram says to Sarai, your maid is in your hands. Deal with her as you think right. And Sarai treats her very harshly, and she runs away, and she ran away from her. So what happens? Who's vulnerable in this relationship? Who ends up feeling terrible at the end of this exchange? Maybe everyone, okay? But definitely Sarai, right? We tend to think, oh, these intended parents, they've got the money, they're going to hire this poor woman to be a surrogate for her. And in the end, right, Sarai feels vulnerable and exploited and terrible about herself as a result of this relationship, right? There isn't an easy sort of hierarchy of vulnerability here, right? Everybody feels a little cheaper. Maybe everybody feels a little greater because of what they've been able to accomplish, right? But what I hope we've sort of gotten to today is the fact that these ethical issues are not, right, black and white, right? As we know, surrogacy isn't ethical or unethical. There are any number of ways to consider this question, and especially when we look at how it operates on the ground and the discourses surrounding that relationship, our picture of what's ethical gets a whole lot more complicated. So that's where I want to leave us with today, the complication. I'm happy to keep discussing it, but I know we want to do Birkat Hamazon and wrap up.
So we'd like to once again thank Dr. Michal Raucher for the tremendous talk, thought-provoking talk. And thank you all for joining us this morning. On a personal note, I thank you for the exercise, and a couple people got it. But a special thanks to Dr. Raucher really for being with us this entire weekend over Shabbat and this morning, and for really bringing up some very important topics and some great learning with us. So thank you. One more time for Dr. Raucher.